Hi everyone, and welcome to our tutorial on enumerations, classes, and structures in Swift 3. I just have the playground open right now, so for those of you who don't know how to do that, just open up Xcode beta and select the playground. And this just kind of allows us to write, and it constantly runs the code so that we can see the outcomes of variables, variable values, the outcomes of functions, and print statements and stuff like that right away without having to actually press the run button. So let's talk about enumerations, classes, and structs. So these are all ways to represent data. Enumerations or enum, basically take on this form. So we have the name, which should be capitalized, name this, and then a bunch of cases with some values. So value 1, case value 2, I really cannot type today, value 2, and so on and so forth. So this is essentially defining a new type. So think about a variable. So we have, let's say we have this variable new int of type int, and we assign it some value. Well, doing the same with an enumeration is not so different. In this case, we're just giving a new type. So this is int. In this case, you could think of integers as being an enumeration of type int. So this is the name. And the list of values that it could take on is vast. It's massive, but not quite infinite. This is doing the same thing. So it's allowing us to define a new type. So in this case, instead of type int, it's of type name. And it could only take on one of two values. Okay, so that's an enumeration for you. Really good for kind of placing restrictions on what values this type can have, and it just allows us to create new types if we're not happy with using one of the current variable types. Whereas classes, so let's just say class, just kind of allows us to create this new instance of a class that has some kind of property 1 and maybe another property 2, and then has some function 1 and then maybe some function 2. Okay, so classes allow us to just create instances that have unique properties and unique functions. So pretty much all your code is going to have to go in classes when it comes to actually designing, building and projects and stuff, and this just allows us to create new objects that have certain behaviors and certain properties. Now structures are kind of in between classes and enumerations, so I'm just going to call this struct, and so take on some of the properties of both. So whereas classes can have functions, structs can only have properties. So property 1 and property 2. Okay, so they cannot take on functions, but they basically just kind of define a new type. So this would be a new type of type struct, and it would contain these properties. Okay, so throughout these tutorials, I'm going to explain a little more about what each one is, and then about how they're useful in relation to each other. So why we'd use an enumeration or a struct instead of a class, and vice versa. And then I'm going to try and show you a bunch of different examples to kind of solidify your understanding of everything. And then at the very end, I'll do a final comparison between the three, and hopefully you guys will have learned a lot by then. Otherwise, enjoy this tutorial, and we'll get started with enumerations right away. Okay, so this first part will be our intro into enumerations. So we're going to talk about what an enumeration is and where we could use one. And then we're going to compare enumerations to variables and why we would use one over the other. Because we'll see that an enumeration kind of defines an entirely new type and gives us a set of possible values, unlike a variable that has a predefined type. Well, rather it has a restrictive type, and that could be something like a float, integer, double, string, whatever. In this case, an enumeration is kind of defining a new type, but we'll be more specific in this tutorial part coming up. Okay, so let's talk about the first way we're going to represent data, and that's going to be through enumerations. Now, what exactly is an enumeration? Well, it's kind of like a way of defining a new type and it kind of allows us to group together a group of associated values. So what I mean by that is if we have this type of object, let's say for example we have a type of hot drink that can contain a few specific values, then it might be a good idea to represent this as an enumeration. So let's just take a look at an example because I think that will help to hammer the point home. So we start it with enum and then we give whatever type we're looking at. So in this case it's going to be a hot drink. Okay, now the first thing to notice, or the first thing to note rather, is that it starts with a capital. And that's because enumerations, classes, and structures should all be capitalized, whereas variables and functions, we want to be lowercase. Okay, so this is basically saying that we have this kind of a type that's going to be a hot drink, and it can contain a few different values. Now, in enumerations, the different values are defined as cases. So we have our first case. Let's just say the first hot drink we could have is maybe a coffee. You know, classic, everyone drinks coffee, right? And then we'll have a tea. And then what else could we have? Maybe a hot chocolate. Ooh, there we go. And then maybe what's some other kind of hot drink? Maybe we can have a hot cider. Okay. Oh, this shouldn't be coast, this should be case. Okay, so what exactly is going on here? Well, we've created this type that's a hot drink, and we've given it four possible values. So this means hot drink has to take on one of these values. So it could be coffee, tea, hot chocolate, or hot cider. Now, how is this different from having a bunch of different variables? Because we could alternately have a few different variables, such as variable coffee, we could have variable tea, could have hot chocolate, and we could have hot cider. Okay, so we could do this, we could have a bunch of variables, but we haven't given them values, and that's something that we'd have to do. So we then have to say that this is either an integer value, we could say that this is 0, 1, 2, and 3. Okay, and that's fine to do. We could then call on these by the name, and we'd get a value in return, such as 0, 1, 2, 3. Or we could assign these to be strings, something like coffee, and in which case we would get these string values back. However, with enumerations, the cases are the values, okay? So we don't need to assign these to be strings or integers or anything else. We can just call on hot drink and call the specific value or reassign these as if they were variables. Okay, so the way we're going to do that is by calling hot drink, or not hot cider, we're going to call hot drink dot, and then let's say, you see here we get this kind of list, this drop down list of possible options. Okay, and that's one of the nice things about enumerations, is it gives us kind of like a limited number of values we can choose from. So we know that it has to be one of these four, and just kind of allows us to put restrictions on the code, because sometimes we will want to put restrictions on the code. So now we have a hot drink containing this value of hot cider. So if this hot drink now contains hot cider, we can assign this to a variable. We can say variable drink of choice equals hot drink dot, let's have a coffee instead. I don't really want a cider right now, so I'm just going to comment that. Actually, no, that's fine. So what this is doing is we're creating this variable called drink of choice, and it's going to contain the value of hot drink.coffee, which should be coffee. Okay, so unlike a variable, it doesn't have to contain something like a string or an integer. It doesn't have to be of that type, because those are all types. With enumeration, we're essentially defining a brand new type. So all of these values are of the type hot drink. Okay, and again, that's why the enumerations are so great for kind of keeping similar values together. Okay, because these are all related, these are all hot drinks, it's good to put them in an enumeration called hot drink. Okay, so what we can do is, using a switch statement, we can kind of create some cases. So let's say our drink of choice is hotdrink.coffee right now. And actually, before we get into that switch statement, I'm going to show you a couple of other things. So the first thing is that, yes, we have our 4 cases here. However, we could put them all on one line if we want. For example, let's say we have another one that's a weapon. We could say case, let's say we have a machine gun. We have a rocket launcher. We have a sniper rifle. And a handgun. Okay, and this is fine to do. This just defines 4 cases, but they're all on the same line, separated by commas. So this is essentially the same thing as saying case this, case that, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's 2 different ways we could write the enumeration. The second thing I want to say is that we can reassign values here. And the way we do that is we just say drink of choice now equals dot, and let's say we want a hot chocolate instead. Okay, so because we've already said that drink of choice is going to be of type hot drink, we don't have to define the type again. We don't have to say we know it's going to be a hot drink again, because we already know it has to be a hot drink. And in this case, we've just kind of reassigned it to contain the value hot chocolate, much like we could reassign a variable such as coffee to then contain the value of 7, for example. Oh, well, I mean, all we need to do is that, and it kind of reassigns a value. That's essentially doing the same thing as down here. So we have a variable. We know it's of type hot drink, which is the enumeration that we created. And, oh, right, well, coffee is our string. So let's just change that to 0. And yes, so we've created our variable. We know it's of type hot drink. It contains a value of coffee right now. And now we've switched it up to hot chocolate. Okay, so yeah. So let's use a switch statement just to demonstrate some stuff that we can do with these enumerations. So we have a switch. And then, oh, that's kind of nice. It fills us out for us. So the value that we're looking for is going to be drink of choice. And the case, the first case is... Okay, the first case is going to be dot hot chocolate. Should be hot drink dot hot chocolate. And then we'll have some kind of code here. And let's just say, let's just have this print something. So it could say print good for reminds me of Christmas. Okay, and then we could have, we don't want a default, we could have another case. And the second case is dot t, and then we could have print good for all occasions. Because, you know, t is always good for all occasions. Okay, and then we could have another case. Do we need the break statement? And what's the error that we're getting here? Expected pattern. Interesting. Oh, I see. And that's why. Okay. So we want that there. Okay, and then our next case could be a dot. Let's see, we got hot chocolate, we got tea, hot cider, and let's just have this print. I don't like hot cider. And that's true, because I don't really personally. And we'll have the fourth case be coffee, and that could be something like I need to wake up. Okay, so now we get reminds me of Christmas being printed out because we're comparing whatever the value of drink of choice has to first the hot chocolate, then the tea, then cider, then coffee. Okay, so each of these is just going to print out a different thing. So in our case, we have the drink of choice equal to hot chocolate right now, but what if we change this to tea? Then we get good for all occasions being printed out. How about hot cider? and just waiting for it to run. Well, we should get this printed out. I don't like hot cider. And there we go. And then the last case, going to be a coffee, and I need to wake up. Okay, so this is just one of the places we can use enumerations, but basically we can use them much like any kind of variable value. Okay, so this is the basic intro into enumerations. In the next part we'll be kind of getting into more detailed stuff, like if it has associated or raw values. So let's just quickly go over what we've learned so far. Well, enumerations are kind of defining a new type. In this case, the type is hot drink, and we're giving it a bunch of different possible values that it could contain. Okay, so this means that these are the only values that hot drink could contain. So these are values in and of themselves, just like these variables have these values 0, 1, 2, and 3. The hot drink has values either coffee, tea, hot chocolate, or hot cider. So in this way, enumerations are good for grouping together variables that could have, it's good for grouping together a bunch of similar values. Okay, we saw the second case with weapons, so you can put them all on one line separated by commas. This is how you could assign a variable to contain that value, and it now contains a value coffee. And note that it's not a string or an integer or anything, this is the value that it contains. We can then reassign it to contain a value like this, hot chocolate, or hot cider in this case, and because we've already told this variable that it's going to be of type hot drink, we only need to call dot and then the next value. And then we just use the switch statement to kind of print out something depending on whatever value our drink of choice currently holds. Okay, so this is some stuff that you can do with enumerations. This next part we'll be talking about raw and associated values. Okay, so this was our intro into enumerations. So enumerations are a great way to define a new type of data that has a limited number of values. So we already have some types of variables in this case, so those types might be something like strings or integers or doubles or characters. Well, in that way, an enumeration kind of defines a brand new type. So in our case, we saw types hot chocolate and weapon. So those are going to be types, and the cases or the values that it contains are the actual values of that type itself. So for example, with the hot drinks, we saw that we had cases that were coffee, tea, hot cider, and hot chocolate. Well, those are the values it contains. They're not values such as strings or doubles. Okay, so this is a great way to group together a bunch of related values, and it allows you to kind of put a limit on the values that this object can contain. So for example, an integer can contain, it can contain numbers between about -2 billion and +2 billion. And strings can be anything between the double quotations. Enumerations allow us to kind of put a limit on what kind of values that our new type can contain.